Almost every day, if you open a paper or switch on TV or go online, I can assure you that you will see one of these headlines. Amnesty International accuses government acts of war crimes. Amnesty International says this corporation is complicit in human rights violations. And I think some of you may know about Amnesty International, obviously, but I hope that everybody else actually asks an entirely reasonable question. Who is this? What is this Amnesty International? Who are these people, and how do they dare to accuse legitimate governments of things like that? So today, in the next 20 minutes, I'll try to answer this question. Because if you do ask this question, it would make you a good Amnesty researcher. So Amnesty International is the largest international human rights movement. We have hundreds of professional staff, researchers, campaigners, advocates, communication specialists, but we also have 7 million members around the world. And as Samantha said, we are completely independent and impartial because we do not take any government money or even money from intergovernmental organizations for our research work. And the bulk of our budget is basically very small donations from all of these members that we have. And we're the movement that works to investigate and expose human rights violations, but ultimately to stop them. And I'm responsible for the part of the organization that is in charge of collecting and analyzing evidence so that we can make conclusions like that. And make sure that also they're rock solid, because even if you didn't ask this question, even if you took us for granted, I can assure you that those whom we target in these investigations, governments or sometimes non-state actors, will not. In fact, they will protest, they will accuse us of being biased, of serving political interests, of manufacturing facts, and increasingly, they will create their own narratives of what happened and support these narratives with fake and forged facts. Something along those lines. This is the very typical response that we usually get when one of our reports comes out. So what is behind these headlines? How does it all work? We work on a huge variety of geographical and thematic issues. At any given moment, we have dozens of researchers deployed in different countries all over the world. We have regional offices from Lima to Hong Kong. We cover thematic areas such as business and human rights, technology and human rights, security and policing, migration, gender identity, and many others. And of course, methodology would differ a little bit depending on the subject, but the core principle remains the same. And this core principle is that we can make these conclusions because we were there. All of our investigations involved field research. There are some exceptions where it's just not possible, and I'll talk about them a little bit later. But in the vast majority of cases, we do not get our facts from papers, we do not get our facts from other organizations, we do not get our facts from internet. It's really our researchers on the ground working very similarly to what, say, criminal investigators do. So they interview hundreds of witnesses and victims, sometimes perpetrators. They collect photographs, they collect videos, they analyze crime scenes, they feel, they smell, they touch, and they very carefully triangulate and corroborate information, because obviously none of these conclusions we can make based on a single piece of evidence, no matter how strong it is. We also have the support of both on-staff and external experts. For example, military experts who often travel with us to war zones in particular, where they're able to look at remnants of munitions, for example, and tell us exactly where this munition came from, who manufactured it, and how it got to this particular place. They could help us determine the direction of an artillery attack or do what is called battle damage assessment. We work with forensic experts whom we can send, for example, photographs and somewhat redacted testimony to determine whether, for example, what we see on the photograph in terms of injuries is coherent with what is described in the testimony as being signs of torture. This work has changed quite a lot in the last couple of years, and it used to be that we would go on the ground, we would usually after the fact, and we would collect information. We would spend, I don't know, 6 months writing a report, then it will come out, then we would go and do advocacy. But now, more and more often, we actually work in real time. We document violations as they occur because we cannot afford to wait until witnesses forget or get intimidated or until evidence disappears. And for that, a couple of years ago at Amnesty, we created a so-called crisis response program. These are some of our most qualified, most experienced investigators who can be sent on a very short notice to mostly conflict zones or, for example, closed countries. And with them, it is not impossible to see them talking to witnesses, looking at remnants of munitions, and then just minutes later talking on the phone to some of the top news agencies, telling them about, just discovered atrocity. And then some more minutes later, talking to a military commander in this area, trying to convince him to stop the atrocities, pretty much. We still use pens and notebooks, as you could see in the slides. But in the last couple of years, we have really started using technology. Technology that allows us to access information in places where we don't have physical access, that allows us to process large amounts of data, that allows us to verify and authenticate information at a very different level. I will just give you a few examples. I know it's not very easy to see on these slides, but I'll try to describe it. I think many of you might remember Darfur. It used to be a horrendous conflict that made headlines about a decade ago, and then it completely disappeared from headlines. And so we decided to conduct an investigation because the abuses there continued. It's just everybody lost interest. But of course, right now, it is impossible. There is no access to Darfur. So what we did, we collected testimonies remotely. Now, fortunately, with various means of communication, it is possible. But then we were looking, from these testimonies, we realized that we are looking at massive destruction and potential use of chemical weapons. So what we did, we commissioned satellite imagery that covered, in this case, hundreds of thousands of kilometers, which was great. We had our eyes on the ground. There was only one problem. We absolutely did not, as you can imagine, have manpower to process. We have satellite imagery analysts, but of course none of them could have processed such enormous amount of data. So what we did instead is we created a micro-tasking platform. So essentially, we divided the satellite imagery into small pieces that our volunteers analyzed. We gave them an algorithm. We conducted a training that allowed them pretty simply to look at before and after images and, following the algorithm, determine where we believe the destruction took place. And thousands of people took part, tens of thousands of people took part in this project, and they were able to complete it just within 2 weeks. And process all of this satellite imagery, all of these hundreds of kilometers, and we were able to identify that 171 villages there were completely or partially destroyed. And then we calculated that the same amount of work would have taken about more than 4 years of one person's time if it were just one person doing that. In another example, we created an unprecedented access to Syrian prisons. And I will take access in quotation marks. But basically, these are prisons in which thousands of people are being tortured, disappeared, executed. And again, one of the places where we don't have access to. But we did have access to witnesses. So we interviewed witnesses who were former prisoners or who were sometimes guards in those prisons. We collected their testimonies, we collected satellite imagery again, we collected drawings, and then we collaborated with a group that does forensic architecture. And based on these testimonies, sometimes people could only describe what they heard because they were blindfolded. Sometimes they could describe what they see. But based on these acoustic and visual impressions, they created the model of this prison. And now if you go on our website, you can actually walk through the cells in this prison and see what people who were there experienced. We use a lot of tools for verification. As you can imagine, now we are very lucky because we have citizen journalists all over the world. No matter where something is happening, you immediately get lots of photos and videos that people have taken. There is only one problem. We cannot really use it as evidence in our investigations unless we're absolutely clear, absolutely sure that they're authentic. And so we created a tool, which we're actually now sharing with other organizations quite a lot, which allows us to extract metadata and to identify whether the video, for example, was tampered with, whether it's authentic, and so on. Another example is we recently started using machine learning, essentially. And that was for a project that focused on Twitter. And I apologize if there is anybody in the audience who works for Twitter, because it was quite critical of Twitter in the end. But we focused on analyzing, on identifying abusive tweets, specifically in relation to women. The first part was focused on female parliamentarians, and the second part of this project, called Toxic Twitter, was actually much broader on about female activists, politicians, and so on. And again, we had about million tweets, more than 1 million tweets to analyze. So basically, we worked with a data scientist to develop a sentiment analyzer that allows us to classify abusive tweets with the help of a computer. And we were able to do this work and to really see the large-scale patterns of abuse and discrimination by analyzing such a significant amount of data. Just recently, we published a report just a few weeks ago on attacks against human rights defenders in Pakistan. And that's kind of very common topic for Amnesty, attacks against human rights defenders. But in this case, it was actually digital attacks. We were looking at their passwords being stolen, malware installed on their computers, their systems that their organizations run being broken into. And so in this case, for our researchers, the field was basically a computer screen. And they spent weeks and months looking and tracking down the path in which this malware was installed on the defenders' computers. And finally, they were actually able to identify the whole infrastructure of these attacks and even identify the perpetrators. So I hope I gave you a good sense that we usually don't just roll out of bed and come up with this type of serious accusations, that we do have arsenal that allows us to conduct them. But if there is one most important notion that I would like to leave you with today, it is that all of these months and sometimes years of investigative work, all of these headlines are just the beginning. Because the idea is not only to collect information and expose violations, although that's a necessary component. The idea is to change the situation, to change the lives of people on the ground. And for that, after such report is published, after these headlines appear, we have lots of ways in which we try to change things. We engage in targeted advocacy. We have our members, thousands of our members taking part in online and offline actions. They write millions of letters. We bring cases in courts. we engage with corporations, for example, or with governments in a slightly non-confrontational way. So we do everything we can to make sure that change happens. And as a result, surprisingly, it works. We are able to get people out of prison. Hundreds of people, and I'm not exaggerating, hundreds of people every year get released from prison or get their death sentence commuted just because an Amnesty researcher in the course of the project came across this prisoner who is unlawfully detained, and then we mobilized millions of people to write letters. And ultimately, officials got tired of having their mailbox flooded with letters and petitions from Amnesty members and decided to give up. We managed to make corporations, sometimes huge companies, oil companies like Shell, pay compensation to victims, for example, of, in this case, pollution in Niger Delta that was caused by them. We cooperate with international courts, and based on our information, just recently, International Criminal Court opened an investigation into potential war crimes in the Philippines, something that was not, particularly on their radar before, and so on and so forth. So it does work. Not always, and not always in full, but it does. And I always find it quite fascinating when you think about it, because that Amnesty is able to do all of these things. Because if you think about it, we don't have any traditional tools, instruments of power. We don't have armies, we don't have weapons, we don't have media empires, we don't have, well-paid parliamentary lobbies. It's literally just, pens and notebooks and now a little bit of technology that allows us to have this impact. But perhaps what I find even more fascinating is that all of this is made possible essentially by people like you. As I said, we have professional staff who conduct investigations, who launch our campaigns, who conduct advocacy meetings. But the power of movement is in its members. None of that would have been possible without the members who give us their time, sometimes their money, their knowledge, their creativity, their energy. These are people who, as Amnesty slogan goes, take injustice personally. These are people who are basically unstoppable in their fight for rights, for justice, for freedom and dignity. And they make all of this possible. Thank you very much.